everybody to Haymarket HQ tonight. Special welcome to Jason for giving up the time to join us, and a very special welcome to Jason's parents who have surprised him by turning up tonight. So George and Pansy, welcome. I met George when I walked in. I shook his hand. He said his name's George, and I said, "Oh, are you Jason's dad?" I could see the similarity already. So welcome here. So, you know, I'm very fortunate, through this inspiration series to be able to interview a number of high achievers, and I'd say Jason is right up there in terms of achievements through his life. When I look at the list, very quickly from degree in arts and a master's in law, Australia's Hauser Global Fellow, he's chairman of his own a number of businesses, youth chair at the New South Wales Ethnic Communities Council, cultural spokesman for the New South Wales Tourism during the Olympic Games. He's been vice chair of the Australia-China Chamber of Commerce, the director of the George Institute for Global Health, governor of the Smith family. There's much more here, but you can sort of get a sense of what kind of things he gets involved with. But and the question I've got for later on is, how does he manage to find the time to do all these things? But let's start off maybe firstly from the beginning. I mean, I tend to think that we're often a product of our upbringing, and I think with Jason it'll be interesting to hear how he grew up and what sort of environment sort of led him to become the person he is. So,
I'm Australian born. I was born in Sydney, actually, in 1971. So this goes somewhere to answering Brad's question about how I did so much. Like, I'm a lot older than probably a lot of you. So I'm 45 this year. So a lot of this stuff is spread over, 20-something years. So at any particular time, there's probably not quite that much going on. But now, our story, Mum and Dad are in the audience, and thanks very much for coming. But Mum and Dad came here from Hong Kong. I think Mum's family migrated to New Zealand first in 1955. Just wanted more economic opportunity, wanted to start a new life, and brave, as I guess many of you and many of your families have done as well. Back in that day, it was a long journey, and there was no social media and no internet, no connectivity then. To go from Hong Kong, to go from Asia all the way to New Zealand, I sometimes sort of think what sort of a journey that would have been, and to start afresh in a completely new place. This is a sort of classic immigrant's story. And then Dad came to Australia in 1960. I think we went to Punchbowl Boys High and did university here. And so, I think a lot of your families as well, this is a classic Australian immigrant's story. And I kind of think that it's a lot of these immigrant values, these Australian immigrant values, that underpin a lot of what I believe and a lot of things that that I do. And I think it's likely that a lot of those things are probably shared by a lot of you guys in the audience as well.
So, did you have your typical Asian upbringing? I mean, did you have tiger parents that made you study hard and focus on certain things?
Well, yeah, I mean, Mum's a school teacher, so she did what she did. She did what she did best, and so we were always. Mum's thing was she would always extend my sister and I at least 2 years ahead of where we were at. So if we were in first grade, we were doing third grade stuff. So but Mum was Mum was all right about it. She didn't cane us, or we had a generally happy childhood. We didn't feel overly pressured around this kind of stuff, probably because we didn't know anything different at the time. But we had a pretty traditional upbringing in some ways. There's things that you get from your family, as you guys know. We generally had hot water, and we showered at night. We didn't shower in the morning. When I went to primary school, my lunches, Mum would generally make sort of the hurfan, the rice with stuff, and I wanted to fit in, right? I didn't want the soy sauce chicken rice. I wanted the Vegemite sandwich, and so I'd trade this with my friends, and my friends said, "Why are you giving up your chicken drumstick for the Vegemite sandwich?" And This was all wanting to belong and wanting to fit in.
Yeah, okay. So from an early age, you know, there was a little bit of embarrassment about being Chinese and, you know, sometimes overcompensating or wanting to be Australian.
Yeah, it was pretty different back then. I don't know how many of you sort of grew up here in Australia through the 80s, through the 70s and 80s. It was pretty different. So I went to Hurstville Public School. I first went to Kingsgrove, and then went to Hurstville Public School. And I tell you, it was pretty different back then. So I think in my year, there were probably about 3 or 4 Asian kids in my year. And, you know, there was a lot of... sometimes I hesitate to use the term racism, but you know, there was a lot of name calling, and there was just because there was difference, right? We were different, and there was a lot of that went on. And look, if I can be frank, it wasn't particularly cool to be different. And this concept of being Asian, I actually think being Asian is really cool now. I think there's a coolness, you know, when the cultures come, the different Asian cultures come. I think there is an element of coolness. And you can find a group, and you can find a pop culture, and you can find an identity, and I think it's a strong, cool identity now, done properly here in Australia. Back in the day, back in the 70s and the 80s, it was tremendously uncool. You were just different, and so I think a lot of people like me, we overcompensated, and we tried to be as Aussie as we could, and. You know, I think that's an experience that a lot of people, I don't know if you had the same experience, Brad, but I think a lot of people sort of that went through this had similar things.
Yeah, I was going to say I've always been cool, but I'd be lying. But yeah, no, I can relate to what you're saying. I mean, growing up, and I went to a boarding school here, you know, I was, I was, you know, trying to fit in myself. And so, and it's not till sort of later in life you learn to appreciate that being different is actually an advantage.
Yeah, so I went to Sydney Grammar. I failed the entrance exam, but somehow Dad managed to wangle me, and I don't know what he did, some sort of side deal to get me into Sydney Grammar. It was a lot less competitive to get in back then than it is now. But you know, we didn't come from a wealthy background. You know, my parents, my mum's a school teacher, and has been. She's retired now, and Dad was a small business person. And you know, I think this is one of the things, and again, it's a immigrant Australian story. Just the sacrifices that our parents make for our education, for our well-being. And I always remember that. I remember times when Dad would pick my sister and I up from Cogra Station. We'd take the train back, and we'd always get treated to like food, and every now and then we'd get Maccas and that. And sometimes I wouldn't know or I wouldn't understand just the cash flow difficulties that my dad. I mean, being in business now, it's not easy managing a cash flow. It's not easy running a small business, you know, with its ups and downs. And I think it's with hindsight that I realise just the sacrifices that Dad made, but we never knew about it at the time. You know, that was hidden from us. So, you know, it's one of these things, the sacrifices for education and the importance for education, the importance on education that my parents put in my upbringing is very much part of my values.
Okay. And I read somewhere that during high school you learned the importance of participating and giving things a go, mostly because it's not something you did in high school.
Yeah, look, I think in high school it was only after high school that I really began, you know, genuinely participating in a lot of different things. You know, I think in high school I did what was required, but I was a pretty bookish kid. You know, in high school I was pretty focused on my studies. And I think it was only at university that I started to get involved in, you know, a number of other things, and that opened up my politics. It opened up different parts of Australian society to me. After uni, one of the first jobs that I did was I did an exchange in the Netherlands, and it was, I didn't particularly have this sort of natural intrinsic interest in international law, but there was this awesome exchange program going on in the Netherlands, and I was studying German at the time as well, and I did an exchange in Germany. So there's this great opportunity to go and study international law in the Netherlands. I thought, well, I've got to go and do this. And it was partly through that I developed this really deep interest in international law and humanitarian law. And one thing led to another. But my first real job outside of uni was with the War Crimes Tribunal, with the UN War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia. This was the Yugoslav Tribunal, and it was like so many other things in life. It was luck and timing. I went to interview there, and it just so happened that there was an Australian judge there, and Sir Ninian Stephen, and I interviewed with him. But what really got me the job was there was a Malaysian judge there, Judge Vora, who I worked for first. Now, his family stayed in Malaysia, and his wife was a barrister who was in London, so he was alone. He was like a 50-something-year-old guy, alone, Asian guy, alone in The Hague. And he looked a bit like my dad. And then he had a son who was about my age, and he hadn't seen for about 2 and a bit years. And I hadn't seen my dad for about a year. So when I walked into his chambers, it was like family reunion. So then we talked about everything other than the law. We talked about where you could get the best curry, like in the Hague, how you survive without hot food. It was like sort of an Asian extravaganza. And so that, in these funny kind of ways that, I got the job through that. And it's interesting reflecting on that, when you think about discrimination and you think about, the job market here in Australia, I mean, naturally you gravitate towards people who share a common, this is the whole diversity thing, right? You gravitate towards people with whom you have common interests and you have that sort of emotional connection. And if you're different, if you come from a different background, it's naturally, harder. And it's one of the things I think we face in the diversity debate. How do you overcome these kind of things? Sometimes it works for you. If you happen to come up with somebody who shares your love of hot food and curry, then it's going to work. If you come up with somebody who doesn't do that and you're not in the mainstream, it can work against you.
Okay. So was it whilst in The Hague that you then you started to hear about Pauline Hanson and decided you needed to do something about it?
The Pauline Hanson stuff actually came later. So the first thing was the Constitutional Convention. So you guys are probably a lot younger, and I don't know if you remember, but the first time we had the big Republic debate, there was first the Constitutional Convention, and then my dad rang me up and said, there's an election for delegates for the Constitutional Convention to debate if we should become a republic. And I thought, well, look, ethnic minorities, we generally don't have a history of participating in these sorts of things. So if we don't put our hand up, we might not have any representation at all. And it's this representation thing that drives a lot of what I try to do, in public life. And so we decided that we'd run, and we were clueless and ran a completely, we had a budget of about $1,000, and we did one ad in the Sydney Morning Herald, and we got some friends together, and I was sitting there, and I had a white baby in one hand, and I had a black baby sort of in the other hand, and the slogan was like a multicultural voice. This was like 1997. And then apart from that, we did, we spoke to a bunch of empty lecture halls, and did some pretty hopeless sort of campaigning, but we got elected, which is interesting because, it shows that there is a market, for that sort of thing. So through ConCon, I had some sort of a public profile through that because, rightly or wrongly, I was credited for having developed that model that in the end was taken to the referendum. And so because of that profile, when all the Pauline Hanson stuff, I went back to The Hague and went back to the UN after the Constitutional Convention. But then all the Pauline Hanson stuff started. So I had a lot of people ringing up saying, you've got to come and do something about this because, you have a profile and it's really important that our voices are heard. And so together with Dr. Peter Wong and a bunch of the other compatriots, we formed the Unity Party and we campaigned in the 1998 federal election. That was the beginning of unity and all the anti-racism and anti-One Nation work we did back in the day.
Okay, so see if I can understand. So you were probably around your mid-20s at this stage. Yep. A lot of people in their mid-20s are still going to nightclubs or having a lot of fun. You were getting into some serious business.
I was still going to nightclubs. And a lot of it was, a lot of what I do is driven by this notion of identity. right? Because if you're born here and you grow up here and you don't have another, there's no other place, right? This is it. This is home. You're an Australian. And then if you have a bunch of people saying, no, you're not really Australian, it's sort of deeply problematic, right? And it really cuts. And so it wasn't just me. I think a lot of compatriots and a lot of people sort of felt driven to do something about that, in our spare time when we weren't partying and going to nightclubs.
Yeah. The Unity Party probably didn't get the results that you were hoping for, but what it did provide you was even more of a public profile, and I think, particularly for the Asian community, they looked at you as this young trailblazer that was representing their interests, and you started to become a bit of a rock star, so to speak, for someone so young.
Yeah, and it was a funny time. And it was really great in one sense because a lot of it was we still lack role models, right? When I look at it and we go, who in mainstream Australia do we look up to? And it's not just people from all backgrounds. Who do we latch onto and who blazes that trail for us? Who are the mentors in there? Who are the trailblazers in there? And something that I guess I was happy that we managed to do was at least for a certain group of people, at least what happened back then was to say, look, there is a place in public life, there is a place in public discourse for people who are different, who look different, who might have migrated here, whose parents migrated here, and that you have just as much a place in Australian society as anybody else, right? But the other thing was I felt myself, like I was getting caught up in a lot of that. I had my best friend who was my publicist. Like I had a publicist then. I couldn't believe it. It was just, and then, and I said, we got to get onto we get onto these lists for these parties, and it was all about how do you keep your profile sort of up and appear in the right places, and getting these television appearances. And I think, Dad at the time was sort of noticing that I was getting caught up in this kind of stuff. And then I had a scholarship. I won the scholarship to go and do my masters at NYU in New York. And I was tossing up, and I had an offer from one of the political parties to run sort of as a candidate, and I was kind of tossing up, do I do the whole political thing now, or do I do my masters in New York and the scholarship? And I remember Dad coming into my room one night, and he said, Jason, if you go to New York now, on the one hand, it's not a great thing to do because everyone will forget about you, because you're just going to be people's political, memories are really short. But on the other hand, it's probably a good thing to do because, you can walk away from it, and if you come back to it one day, then you're doing it, for the right reasons. So, wise old advice from the father, but I think it was prescient. I think it was prescient advice.
Yeah. Okay. So you walked away from politics. So after the Unity Party, you got involved with the Republican movement. But after that, it was a long break from politics. So you sort of got out of the public eye for a while after that. It was probably, and I'll jump here, around 2013, Kevin Rudd gave you a call. You were in China at the time, living and working, asked you to come back and run for the seat of Bennelong.
Yeah, so since then, I really went into business and went into the corporate world first, and then did a lot of entrepreneurial things, and I was living in China, and we'd been in China at that time for about 8 years, and we'd just gone through this big corporate planning thing when my partners and I were just sort of deciding what we were going to do for the next year. And then Kevin Rudd rings up and goes, our candidate just blew himself up in Bennelong. Do you want to run? And this was like 6 weeks out from the campaign, and I kind of had an inkling that it might have been coming because people were sort of pinging me about it, but I didn't expect it would happen so quickly. And so then it was a really big choice about, do we do it? And, we were living in Beijing at the time, and how do we actually do this? Like, how do we come back and actually run this campaign and do it credibly? And it was a fabulous experience. We didn't expect to win, because there was that huge sort of blowback against the Gillard Rudd thing at the time. But it was such a fabulous thing to do. Something that was really interesting though was that because I'd literally gotten off a plane from Beijing, everybody assumed that I was this PRC Beijing guy who just, Kevin Rudd sort of tapped on the shoulder, you know, got off the plane and was the Labor candidate for Bennelong. People didn't realise that, you know, I was born here and all of the history. And it was weird. So when I was going around handing out and I was just talking to people saying, you know, hi, I'm Jason, I'm the Labor candidate for Bennelong, they're like, oh gee, your English is pretty good. And, you know, where did you get your accent from? It's amazing. Like, you know, so, you know, there was that whole, thing about, and you see it now in the public discourse, and this is a whole other topic about, you know, China and Australian politics. You guys would have seen that ABC Fairfax sort of reporting on Chinese influence in Australian politics. I mean, this is a whole other story about, you know, this really complex issue, and how do you deal with, how do we as a country deal with, you know, things like that without completely disenfranchising, you know, everybody who looks vaguely Chinese in Australia.
Yeah, and back to the English comment, I mean, you know, your English is pretty good. You topped the state in English in 3-unit English BHSC, so, you know, that's probably allowed you to utilise or become a lawyer and utilise those skills.
But these are some of the stereotypes, right? So, you know, that if you look different, you know, you're constantly facing these stereotypes. I remember, you know, just after I got the English Association Prize, I used to wait tables at the, it used to be called the Park Plaza Hotel down in Haymarket back there, and you know, just serving people, you know, on tables, and you know, just remarks that people would make. You know, I'd say to somebody, you know, can I take your plate when they were finished, and you know, in this tone, people would go, yes, but it's may I take your plate. You know, you just sort of get this sort of stuff that is, you know, I think a lot of us have experienced, and this is the sort of stuff that, you know, I hopefully will motivate a lot of us to do the sorts of things that we do, and to make these statements, to say that we're as Australian as anybody else here.
Yeah, okay, and so just for the audience as well, I mean, so the seat of Bennelong covers areas like Eastwood, Marsfield, parts of Epping, so, you know, a high Asianised area, and so it sort of made sense for Rudd to sort of also tap him on the shoulder and hopefully get the support of the Asian voters, but it was a little bit too late, I guess. You know, you didn't have a lot of time to campaign.
Yeah, we had about 5 weeks from the start, so it was a really short campaign. And it was a complex thing as well, because we were perceived to be the, you know, Beijing to Bennelong. Like, everybody thought that we literally just, I was this Chinese guy that stepped off a plane and started campaigning in Bennelong. And, you know, this is the whole thing about, you know, racial politics in Australia. It's a complicated thing. I don't think you can mark it to any particular community. It's not to say I don't think that just because I have Chinese heritage that every Chinese person is going to vote. You know, for me, I think that's profoundly, you know, not the case. So, you know, we did all right in Bennelong in the circumstances. We didn't win a seat, and look, it was a disappointing outcome. Not so much for myself, because I think we were expecting it. We went into it not expecting to win. Although there's always that little, you know, part of yourself that, you know, hopes that you can do better than, you know, that something special would happen. But I think what it really showed me was most of the disappointment was for the supporters. And I think that was probably the biggest thing I took away from the campaign, why you really do it. And I didn't know this at the beginning, but why we really did it was, it's really the people, the branch members and the local people who help you. And these are, and the same thing is for the Liberal Party. It doesn't matter which side of politics you're on. The people in the branches do this. They volunteer their time because they genuinely believe in, you know, the mission and the policies and the values. And certainly on the Labor Party side, these are guys who, a lot of them are retired, a lot of them are unemployed, a lot of them have disabilities. And they're up every morning at 6 a.m. in the train stations just handing out to you. And I think one of the really big epiphanies I had from the campaign, there was a homeless woman. I don't know if you guys remember, those who live around Eastwood, but she used to push a trolley around the streets of Eastwood. And she came in, and then one of the campaign staff called me. I was upstairs doing something, called me down and said, "Josie, you're going to come down and have a look at this." And she had come into the campaign office with a $50 note and said, "I want to donate this." This is a homeless woman. "I want to donate this to the campaign because it's so important, what you're doing." And it's through these things that you realise this is really why you're doing it. You're doing it for people like that. You're doing it for the branch members who come out and help you. And that was the real source of the disappointment when we didn't get up.
Okay, another interesting story whilst you're campaigning, and I saw a photo of this. There's a photo of a poster of yourself and your family. Now, your family is, you've got Lucy, your wife, who's a white Anglo-Saxon female, and then your three young kids, so Eurasian kids. And plastered on your face was a sign that said something along the lines of "No more Asians. It's not the face of Australia. We speak English. Save our Aussie culture, etc., etc." Some pretty racial notes, and I guess very much in your face. How did you deal with that kind of thing? And it was probably, I'm assuming you saw that multiple times.
For me, it was water off a duck's back because it's very common. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, you had this all the time, even through university. There was this catch cry around the 1990s, get on your boat, catch cry. That was the thing, back in that day. And so, I guess for me, it was fine because it was something that I was very, very used to. It was unacceptable, but it was something I was very used to. What was really worrying was for my kids because they'd never experienced this sort of stuff before, and I really wanted to shield and protect them from it. And that's probably the most concerning thing, with the debate now. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like the broad consensus around diversity and inclusion in Australia is going a bit backwards right now, and I think it's a really worrying trend. And I really worry because I've got 3 young kids now, and they've grown up in where they're not aware of their sort of difference or their identity. They're Eurasian. And they grew up in China, so in some ways they realise that they're not Chinese. They're always the Laoai, in China. But coming here, they've never had this. They've never experienced this sort of racism before, and I just don't know how to explain it to them, and I don't want them to experience that, that kind of thing. So, look, I think that this whole racial environment and this whole environment around diversity and inclusion, I think it's getting worse in Australia, and we're trying to do a number of things right now to counter that. So if any of you are interested in some of the things that we're doing, I'd encourage you come and have a chat to me afterwards.
You got headhunted to work for Insurance Australia Group as head of sustainable development. So that's a pretty senior role, working in a corporate environment, which often involves dealing with the politics of the environment. What did you learn there? How did you manage those politics?
It was a really special role. This was in the early 2000s, and it was a view of business that really drives how I view business right now. And it was very much about how do you use the resources and the motivators of business, the capitalist motivation, to do good for a community or do good in the world. This is this whole social enterprise. So when you think of, this is IAG, so this is like the NRMA brands. And the thinking was that as an insurance company, right, everything that goes wrong out there in a society, an insurance company pays for, right? Because it's got to pay claims. So every car accident that happens, every theft that happens, every extreme weather event, and roofs getting blown off, that people, the sizes that it's related to climate change, drug problems and how it results in weak communities and crime. All of these things insurance companies pay for out of their claims costs. It comes straight out of their bottom line. And so one of the things that we were trying to work out was, how do you think of the purpose? What is the real purpose of an insurance company? And how do you align that purpose with something that actually is very meaningful in a community and society. And this was in the early 2000s, and I think some of that thinking has developed somewhat now. But what we were trying to do then, and I still haven't seen quite so much now, is how do you make it more than just CSR or corporate social responsibility or a marketing thing? How do you completely embed it in the products that you offer, your customers and the way you do business? And that was a really special thing about, the potential for an insurance company to do that. In some way, through your business, Brad, you do that through Haymarket HQ. You guys are in the property business. How do you take meaningful spaces and put that into a community to catalyse, great things through spaces and destinations? It's a similar kind of thinking. So, those of you guys in business, I'd encourage you to think about, well, what is the purpose? What's the core purpose of what your company does? How do you align that to something in the community, an issue? And how do you make that a competitive advantage in many ways?
I guess, you had that role, but you had to do it within the confines of this big corporate structure, okay? And so, your background wasn't necessarily corporate, and you got sort of elevated to a pretty senior position without necessarily learning the ropes. How do you maneuver yourself within, the bureaucracy, within the politics of the organisation? How did you work your way through that system?
Look, it was a big learning curve in the sense that everything that I'd done, it was all about me, right? And then a lot of the time that's what politics is. It's quite presidential. It's all about you. And then one of the things that I guess I learned in a corporate environment is it's not about me. It's more about how do you empower everybody around you, and how do you get things done through empowering people around you. And that was something that I really didn't understand at the time. It was a really steep learning curve, but it's so valuable now because I have this thing about the political class in Australia. So many of our politicians have done nothing else but politics, right? They've been staffers and unionists. They've worked as in the machine politics, and they haven't done anything else. And so, how do you learn these skills of how to get things done through influence and through, mobilising and working through people other than you, where you let other people take the credit and you empower other people to do things? They're very much corporate skills, and they're very much organisational skills.
Okay. And then, as you grew older, you found that you wanted to discover more of your Chinese heritage. And I know with myself, from a young age, rebelling against being Chinese, my parents forcing me to go to Chinese school and not paying attention, to the point now where I'm a bit embarrassed that I can barely speak Chinese, that my general manager, a redhead here, is more Chinese than I am, and speaks Chinese fluently. For me it was a little bit too late, but when you were with IAG, you got the opportunity to set up their China practice or enter the China market.
Yeah, so, you take the opportunities when they come. It was sort of like IAG wanted to go to China, so they looked around for the most Chinese-looking guy, and they went, "Oh, you look Chinese. Why don't you go up to China?" Which was fine. It was an opportunity. So I went up there, and we tried to replicate the NRMA strategy. So we bought the NRMA of China, which was called China Automobile Association, and the thinking was that through that customer relationship, from helping somebody when they break down, we could then cross-sell insurance. And it was a disaster. It didn't work at all. It was very difficult to cross-sell insurance and to sell the whole road service thing, because the Chinese went, "Why am I going to pay you, 300 RMB a year to come and help me when I break down? Because when I break down, I'll just call one of my friends, and then they'll come and I'll call it." So the mentality was just very different, and we didn't understand the market. But we also negotiated, and we actually signed to buy a quarter of the second biggest Chinese insurance company at the time, called China Pacific. Now this was in 2004, and this was pre-IPO. I don't know if you guys have followed it. This was, at the time, this was just as the Chinese economy was going ballistic. And there were very few national franchises, and these things were tremendously valuable at the time. It was just when a lot of these national Chinese franchises were beginning to get big and then beginning to access the capital markets. So IAG at the time, we valued this company at about 1.6 billion. Incredibly, thinking about it now, and we had a stake valued at about 400 million, and this was pre-IPO, before China Pacific IPO'd. If we had managed to make that stick, after we signed the deal, we lost it, and they decided, the Chinese company decided to renege on the contract. And this came as a huge shock. I mean, the board of IAG were like, right, we've got to sue them. And we're trying to explain that you can't sue them because, you'd be suing the Shanghai government, it's not going to work, And so there were all these politics around it, and just the journey of an Australian company learning to do business in China. But it was a tremendous shame, because had we got that stake would have been worth at least 10 times now, what it was.
Yeah. So it was definitely a learning experience in China, and I think one of the other things that you learn, other than how to speak Chinese, was just how to do business in China. Whereas to the extent you've now have your own businesses that help companies do business in China better, and you have a lot of your business focus on that relationship with China now.
Yeah, there's so much that at the time, even during IAG's time, we tried to take things from Australia and put them into the market, and some of them didn't work, but some of them were hugely impactful. Like a lot of the NRMA advocacy stuff around road safety, like crash testing. We took a lot of that into the Chinese market around the mid-2000s. I don't know how many you've seen in not just China but in Asia, like the driving habits, right? So you've got no seatbelts, you've got little babies in the front seat with their heads really close to the airbags. You've got these things that just from a developing country you see all the time. So one of the things we did was really interesting. We took a lot of the NRMA advocacy stuff and we ran demonstrations. We put it out in the media. So we had this experiment where we put a watermelon next to an airbag, and we exploded the airbag, and the watermelon just sort of disintegrated. And we invited all the Chinese media to film it, and it had a really big impact up there. But now, there's still a lot of things, and we spend a lot of our time and a lot of our business efforts now taking sort of interesting things from Australia and working out how to find niches in the Chinese market for these things. A lot of what we do is around natural products.
Yeah. Okay. And there's also the corporate advisory side as well.
Yeah, so we have an M&A practice. It's a specialist sort of cross-border corporate finance shop that we do. And almost all of our transactions have to do with China. And we do our own investing in distinctively Australian Chinese business stories, as well as socially impactful technologies such as refugee talent. And I see some of the refugee talent people in the audience.
So Anna's here tonight. So Anna is the CEO of Refugee Talent. Now, this is an interesting story because you met Anna whilst she was driving an Uber for you somewhere. Yeah, tell us that story.
Yeah, so I get into an Uber and Anna's there, and so we're just chatting. She picks me up, and I go, so what are you doing when you're not driving an Uber? And she goes, I've just done the startup, and because we do a lot with startups. I go, oh, well, what's your startup? And then Anna tells me her story about how she's a sports and recreation officer in Nauru. And one of the epiphanies, one of the things, the insights that she has is not just about how awful it was up there, but how so many of the people who were locked up were people like us, like essentially the Syrian middle class. Software engineers, architects, lawyers, really highly skilled people. And I think Anna had an epiphany that, this is just such a waste. And so she teamed up with Refugee Talent's co-founder, Narari, who's a Syrian software developer, and built this technology platform that matches skilled refugees with meaningful work opportunities here. And it's just been going tremendously well. So I encourage you to have a chat to Anna, in the break.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you did quite well was, when Refugee Talent needed some angel investment, you got together a bunch of your contacts, and you managed to, get some of that initial funding to help them, get started and get to where they are now.
Yeah, and it's sort of where I'd like. I think, I'm 45 now. So we made a decision recently. We just finished a very big project and in our business, and I've made the decision to spend a significant portion of my time doing things that are just more socially impactful. And we're very lucky that we have the freedom to do that. And so, we'd like to seed a number of things, a number of, socially impactful things. And I think a lot of the time, it's about understanding what you're good at, but just as much understanding what you're not good at. And one of the things that I am good at is bringing people together, particularly around causes. And so when there's a business that's also a cause, that's a really nice fit for what we do.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the question of purpose then. I mean, how do you want to be defined, or what is your purpose you feel in your life now?
It's a big question. I think from a political perspective, what I would really like to see is an Australia in all aspects of it, right? That reflects our streets. So if you look at this room here, it'd be great to see, a parliament or a board of directors of an ASX 50 country that looks like this. Right? It'd be great. It's interesting if you watch the mainstream news, even in the UK or in the US, you will see African American people, you will see Middle Eastern people, you will see Indian people, you will see Asian, North Asian sort of people as mainstream anchors. In Australia, you don't. Unless it's SBS, the exception is SBS, but you don't hear it. And I think there's something about Australia that we need to crack, around this. And so something that is really important to me that I'd like to see is across all of these areas of leadership in Australia, I'd like to see that diversity that reflects what our streets look like.
Does that mean you're going to get back into politics?
Look, I'd like to one day. It's a complicated thing, and it's complicated with with the major parties. I don't know if any of you are sort of political, at all, but these are the barriers that we need to break down when you are trying to break into something, whether it's a company or a group or a political party, and everybody in there is pretty much from a particular group, and there isn't the role models, and there aren't the leaders in there to influence people. How do you do that? And so that's what we're trying to bust through at the moment, and hopefully we can get somewhere with that. I'm confident we can. If I can't in my generation, it's over to you guys. But hopefully we can do as much as we can. Look, I'm reasonably thick-skinned. I tend to stress out a little bit too much. My dad always tells me, and I need to learn to calm down. In times of stress. But there's a lot more to politics than just being able to talk in public and being able to there's unfortunately so much of politics now is all the machine stuff, and it's all that sort of infighting stuff, and all of that kind of stuff that unfortunately is the nature of politics nowadays. And the question is, how do we change that overall system? I think a question that people are beginning to talk about now, I don't know what you guys think, but will there come a time when Australia will have its own en marche, its own Emmanuel Macron moment, when people are so sick of the major parties that something comes out of nowhere, a new party comes out of nowhere, a really centrist party, and people go, right, that's what we're going to vote for.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I want to ask you, why would you be willing to put yourself out there again, time and time again? And I'll be blunt here, the Unity Party, you had a loss there. The Republican movement, which you were in the leadership of, you weren't successful there. When Kevin Rudd came and asked you to run again, you weren't successful. And so, there's, I guess, a number of failures there. And with that, there's a lot of personal attacks on your reputation and on your family. Why would you want to do that again?
It's the same as startup world, right? I guess you guys are attached to Haymarket HQ. You got to fail X number of times until you finally get there. And so this is, and it's particularly the case when it's not about, if it's not about yourself and these things. Luckily, on the family side, luckily in Australian politics, the family is generally off limits. So unless you put them in the game, generally your family would not get attacked, and that's luckily still something that's sacrosanct. So my family is largely protected, except to the extent that they see less of me, because I'm involved in other things. But aside from that, the family is okay. In terms of the failure, this is a truism, but you got to keep failing until you succeed, because otherwise you either just don't do it. You go, all right, well I give up, and you don't do it. But these sorts of issues, you've just got to keep going. And as I said, the same applies for startups. You got to keep starting up until you get the breakthrough. Our family was an interesting mix between Confucian and a traditional Chinese sort of upbringing and a very Western upbringing, and it's a nice marriage. And I credit to my parents for just finding that balance. In some ways, we were really Chinese. The importance of education, the importance of family, is really central to my upbringing. But there was other stuff as well, where we're very Australian in many ways. I think my wife is Caucasian. Never an issue, with that. In terms of our friends and how we conduct ourselves, completely, Australian. But also some things around, for instance, when my wife and I first got started, my parents didn't buy us a house, but they gave us a little bit of money, such that we were always ahead on our repayments. And it's interesting, it's something I'd like to do with my kids. So I don't want to buy them a house, because then you don't teach them the value of money and the value of hard work. It's a little bit too easy a ride. But I'd like to give them just enough so that they've got to work hard and pay off the house, but they're never going to be under so much debt and pressure that they never get ahead. And I think that's a really good way to do it. And similarly, Mum and Dad, even though I was born here, before I went to kindergarten, I couldn't speak English. And I don't know if it was a deliberate thing, it probably was, but Mum and Dad spoke to me almost exclusively in Chinese, even though we were here. So when I went to kindergarten in first grade, I had poor English, and I had a serious lisp going on. I had an F and TH lisp. So I used to go 1, 2, 3, 4. So and these were just things. But because of that, I kind of kept my Chinese through it, because I had such a strong sort of foundation. So again, I want to give credit to my parents for having the foresight of how do you raise kids in a new environment such that they keep what's important, but they can adapt to the broader environment.
Yeah, and I think your dad's a very practical guy. I mean, he's given you a lot of practical advice through the years. I had a brief chat to him, and he was already telling me about how, he's 76 and he's now starting to think about, when he passes on, some of the practical things he needs to start to get prepared for. And one of those was making sure that all his passwords get given to one of his kids so that they can, access their bank accounts and things. So, yeah, that was a interesting conversation with your dad. He also gave you some other practical advice about, doing some things before you're 30.
Yeah, one of the things that Dad would say is before you turn 30, just live in as many places and have as many experiences as you can. And then when you turn 30, start thinking about getting your shit together. I think it was pretty good advice. But on the other hand, it's a product of personality as well. I have the sort of personality that I like juggling a lot of things. I like lots of different projects. If I'm stuck at one thing for too long, I find myself getting bored with it, very quickly. And it's not about one way or the other. That's just the way I am. So.
Yeah. So how do you manage your time with all of that? How do you juggle all these competing priorities and the family and everything else?
It's again a truism, but it's good people around you. So recognising you're not the smartest person in the room, it's best to have people around you who are smarter than you are, and having them do what you cannot do, but being the facilitator and being the enabler and being the motivator around that.
Okay. Well, how do you find good people? What do you look for?
Often it's just a feeling. It's hard to put your finger on it, but I think a lot of the time, sometimes and I find myself doing, I have to force myself not to do that. Everybody wants to be nice to people, and I think we have a certain politeness here in Australia, and I think it's natural to want to be liked. It's so important when you're hiring to not want to try to be nice and not want to try to be liked. This is something that I think I learned a long time ago.
Okay.
So apart from parents, obviously, there've been a few epiphanies. One was the judge that I worked for at the UN, Sir Ninian Stephen. You guys, he's still around, and he's still active. And what was the amazing thing about Sir Ninian Stephen? He had been a Governor General, he'd been a Chief Justice of the High Court, he was Australia's judge at the UN. And this guy was just so incredibly humble. He had a way, like we were just lowly shit kickers, and he would invite us in, he would take our opinions seriously. He was just the most humble, down-to-earth guy. And what that showed me was that there is absolutely no excuse for arrogance. And I have a really, really low tolerance for arrogance, because if you can achieve what he had achieved and still be as humble as he was, that was just awesome. Beyond that, I'm not really into the worship or looking up to particularly successful people, because I tend to think that there is a lot of extraordinary stuff that happens with ordinary people. And you guys probably know these stories just within your own friends. So just simple acts of courage or resilience or just strength that I reckon go far and beyond a lot of the celebrities that you see around. People become famous or they're known for something. But I could name just off the top of my head a range of my friends who've been through things, lost family, lost children, fought causes, faced adversity, did amazingly courageous things, but nobody knows about them because they just do it. And so I'm not really into hero worship. I'm much more into, people around you and recognising the amazing things and the amazing strength that they have.
Yeah. Okay, but I think the thing you learnt a lot from Sir Ninian Stephen was his humility, and that's sort of something that's been important to you.
Yeah, it is I would say that I'm pretty judgmental around arrogance. I just can't handle arrogant people. And even if you have a reason to be arrogant, it's something that, it's one thing that I find just really unacceptable. I had lunch with Malcolm Turnbull, who was my first mentor through the Republican movement a while ago, and I asked him, Malcolm, what's your secret? How did you, it was the same question, what's your secret sauce? And he said to me, and I agree with this, he said it is a very, very large part luck. He said, I was in the right place at the right time when certain things happen. And, sure, he's super intelligent, and sure, he put himself out there and create that kind of stuff, but this notion of fortune and luck is at least part of it. The other part is around participation. You've got to put yourself out there, and you've got to be in the places where the luck can happen to you. So this is this notion of participating and just getting involved and getting out there and creating the opportunities. The last thing is around being authentic. and I guess that means understanding yourself, being true to yourself. So I don't want to name any names, but if you look at, and you guys would know, think of leaders, be they political leaders or business leaders, and just have a think about how they communicate and who they are and how they project. And ask, are these guys really authentic? Are they projecting who they really are deep down? Because I think people feel that. And if you're not authentic, people get it, they can sense it, and they won't trust you, and they won't believe you, they won't come on the journey with you. So I think if there's one thing, if you can be authentic in what you do, I think that's critical.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I've noticed with you is your ability to create relationships. I mean, just since the time we've known each other, I see you know a lot of people, high public profile people, and I've seen the way you interact with other people. We were at a dinner last week. It was a black tie dinner, and we had a lot of politicians and so forth. And I had a friend that I introduced you to, and you took the time, and all your attention was on her, and I just saw how you interacted. It was like, tell me about yourself, and it was authentic, and it made that person feel special. And I think it's a real gift or a skill that you've somehow developed to make people feel that they can connect with you.
Well, thanks, Brad. I mean, I don't actually think I'm all that good at it, in the sense that I'm horrible with names. Maybe you're Edward. I mean, I'm horrible with names, and it's something I have to force myself to do. Some people are really good, with names, but sometimes it doesn't come sort of naturally. But I think a lot of it is having a diversity of interests and being genuine about what you're interested in, and genuinely liking people. If you don't genuinely like people, if you don't genuinely like people, it's really hard to do that kind of stuff. But there's a difference between genuinely liking people and being an introvert. You can be an introvert, but you may genuinely like people, and that is consistent. I would probably bring that down to purpose. Again, I think that's an overriding kind of thing, and I think it's something that is really important for people our age, our peer group. You spend so much time at work, and there's so much going on all around you. If there's one sort of thing that I'd urge you guys to think about is think about purpose, and why you do what you do. And if you don't really know what you do, or the purpose behind why you're doing it, think about what is really important to you. And this is something I remember from something that Henry Kissinger said. I have a funny story about him that I'll tell you guys another time. But he said something really interesting. He said, in terms of career, do the most important thing that you can think of doing and that you are able to do, and then everything else will work itself out from that. The money, the success, everything else will flow from that. But do the most important and purposeful thing that you can do.
So just, I guess on behalf of everyone, I just want to thank you, Jason, for your time. Thank you for your very interesting insights, and I think, from a personal point of view, I think there's so much more you can contribute to this country, to this community. So, I really do encourage you to keep going like the way you have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Thanks for being here.